Hello, it's me! I'm back! It's the Nutty Professor! I'm still alive, and I'm still clean. 7 weeks clean today. No booze, no other stuff, In the last podcast, I introduced myself, gave a little background, talked about the word junkie. And I'm going to take off this hat because it's getting hot. I introduced the word junkie. There was one thing I forgot to mention, and it's sort of interesting, so I'll bring it up here. The origin of the word junkie, it actually came from heroin addicts would collect junk, scrap metal, and take it to junkyards and sell it to, pay for their habits. Today, they don't do that. There's other ways of supporting habits, and we'll get to all of that later. Now, another thing that I wanted to add to the last podcast, I did mention a couple of Jungian terms. They're fairly straightforward, but I did mention persona. I don't think I defined it. Now, in Jungian theory, persona is a mask. It's what you show the world, And it actually comes from the Greek word for mask. The Greek actors would wear these big masks. So from way back in the theater, you could see expressions of anger or joy, And I used to point out in my personality theories lectures, it's interesting that the word personality originates from the word mask, I think I also mentioned introversion and extroversion. And these are Jungian concepts, but other people have taken them different ways. It's fairly complicated in Jungian theory because you do have the 4 functions and you have unconscious and so on. But I will say that I believe that I myself am an introvert. However, my persona is the ultimate extrovert. The Nutty Professor. My students never believed that I was an introvert. They would always, even on their essays, they would say, the professor claims to be an introvert, but we don't believe him. He's an extrovert because they see me jumping around and, foaming at the mouth. This is my persona. And one of the points I will make as we go through this is that I do believe that the 12-step programs, the group processes, work better with extroverts. They don't work as well with introverts. So we'll come back to that. There are other Jungian concepts like shadow and anima, animus, but we will get back to those later. Podcast. My crew, and thanks to both of them again, my producer and my editor, they commented that they liked the junkie stories. They were like, junkie stories, we like them, And I'm like, yeah, I can see why, because junkies live their lives on the edge. Podcast from the edge, it's more interesting, it's outside of the box, but. And I've got a lot of junkie stories. I've written about the junkie stories, and I change names, and I try to make them anonymous. And eventually, hopefully, when I get published, you guys can get junkie stories. But I will mention a few, the kind of the tamer ones, and I also thought of how, if any of my former students are watching this, they're probably going to be sitting there going, why hasn't Professor Rashid told a cat story yet? Because they used to love my cat stories, So, and it's a little difficult coming up with a cat story when talking about addictions, One of my first cats, Loki, and people now know the name Loki because Avengers, the Norse god of mischief. But Loki, my cat, not the god, but my cat Loki, he was very addicted to cable chewing, any kind of cable. he'd chew it, and I used to call him, I go, yo, you're a junkie like your father, my current cat, she's got 3 names: Sohail Rashid. She's got a middle name, Sia is the Egyptian word for perception, the goddess of perception, actually, So, but my mother is very attached to Agita. I don't have any human children. I'm an only child. So Agita is their only grandchild. When Agita was a couple of years old, I brought her some catnip, and my mother saw Agita eating this thing and playing and jumping around, and my mother's like, what is that you are giving Agita? And I go, it's catnip, Mom. And she goes, what's catnip? And I said, it's like marijuana for cats. And she freaked out. She was like, don't turn my baby, my grand kitten, into a drug addict. No catnip. So since then, there's been no catnip for Agita. That's the only cute cat story I could think of that sort of touches on, substances. Now, what I want to do today is, I want to talk a little bit more about how, and I mentioned this in the last podcast, how I've had to come up with my own approach. I'm forming my own path because the 12 steps didn't work for me. And as we proceed, we'll talk more about why the 12 steps didn't work for me. I think part of it is my being an introvert. Another part is the spiritual aspect. Not that I completely disagree with spirituality, but I don't like the way it's packaged, and the asking the loving God, humbly beseeching the loving God to take away your cravings, I'm not going to do that, And even other steps I don't personally agree with, they just rub me the wrong way. So I've tried to come up with, and the way that this has worked is, I didn't set out to go, I'm going to come up with alternate steps, I just found that 12 steps didn't work for me. I went to one meeting, people said, you're going to do this, you're going to die, and I go, but this is not the way I'm going to do it, I'm not going to go to meetings, I'm not going to chant, I'm not going to pray, I'm not going to ask the higher power, to take away my cravings. I've been battling the cravings on my own, What I'm going to present to you now is my own, it's trial and error. Some work, some don't. I've looked at what I've done, and I've tried to organize it, So I have 6 points. I don't even want to call them steps, I've got 6 points, And then the 6th point is divided into another 4 sub-points. So you get about 10. Okay, let's call them steps. We got 10 steps, So we've got, I call it PATAP. P-A-T-A-P.
P-P-A-P.
And that stands for Personalized Approach to Addictions. And the P, the last P, I thought a program, but it's not really a program, Process, a personalized approach to addictions process. Or it could just be personalized approach to addictions. PATA, Now, so I've got acronyms, I was just playing around with it. So I've got acronyms for each of these. Now, my first point, number 1, I call to turn back or not. And the acronym for that is TBON, Taban, And you can see there's an immediate difference here in my approach and the 12 steps, because in the 12 steps, the 12th step is, now that we have been saved, now that we've had our spiritual awakening, it's our obligation to go out and spread the word and save other addicts and help them, My view on that is, it's a personal choice, if you want to turn back, you want to battle, you want to put the effort into it, do it, and if you can go 12 steps, you can chant and pray, great, You can't go 12 steps, you try something else. You come up with your own approach, But if you don't want to turn back, if you're like going, I want to keep going, keep going. I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm not going to judge anyone. And whatever you're doing to obtain your substance of choice, and probably illegal, For legal purposes, I'll go, oh, keep doing whatever you're doing as long as it's legal, But whatever you're doing, keep doing it, You don't want to turn back. You don't, you don't want to put the effort into all of this. Just live your life on fast forward. Now, people keep saying, oh, junkies die young. And, it depends. I mean, Burroughs lived till 95. My former employee is still going at 70. Some junkies are like cockroaches. You can't kill them, On the other hand, some expire. But anyway, that's your choice, My number one is turn back or not. Number two is if you do decide to turn back. So you've gone past the denial and you've, gone, I'm turning back. I want to stop doing this thing that's probably not good for me, What I did was I made up a list. Why am I turning back? What is there for me to stay here for? And in this world. And a little junkie story here. I am a binger. I'm not a daily user. And when I did consider residential rehab last year, I talked to this guy. He was very helpful, the director of the place, and he believed that it was just a question of my not finding the right 12-step meetings. And he said, I'll take you to different meetings and we'll try to get you the right, and we corresponded for a while. But he got a little excited when I told him, the nature of my addiction. And he goes, oh, so you're a binger. And I go, yeah. I'm a binger, And one of my rationalizations was that, and I use this as a metaphor, I said, I'm not a resident here. I'm not, I don't live here in the world of addiction. I visit. I'm a tourist, I come, I stay a day, 2 days, I go home, But the binges have been getting longer, and more dangerous, So there 2-3 nights without sleeping or eating at my age is getting riskier, On one of my later binges, I was binging with someone who, and I mentioned this. I said, I think I'm a tourist. I don't live here. And she said to me, you know what? You're not a tourist anymore. She goes, you've been issued a passport. You are a citizen of addiction land. And I'm like going, oh shit. She might be right. The whole thing here is, okay, if you don't want to remain in addict land, and you go, oh, I need to go back to the real world. What do I need to go back for? Why am I going back? Why am I fighting this? Why am I not just giving into it, living on fast forward? Come what may. It's a hard life. It's day to day. It's very tough. I'm not glamorizing this. It's a tough life. I know that. But if you decide you want to get out, what are you getting out for? And I have a list. My list is flexible. It changes. And the one thing that doesn't change is number one on my list is my cat, because my cat is my child, and I'm responsible for her, The number one on my list is, for other people, it might be a human child or a partner or some human, But for me, my cat is my child. So the number one on my list has not changed, The other things, they've kind of fluctuated. I think I actually started off with number two was the things I still need to get done. I'm not teaching anymore, but, I want to get my work out there. I've got a lot of manuscripts. I want to get them published. And I wanted to do podcasts, and now I've got to them, But, and even if I hadn't died, if I'd had a heart attack and been incapacitated, I wouldn't have got to this point, So I had things I wanted to do, and I also had my elderly parents to look after. But as I've said, they've left the country for now. They're being looked after elsewhere. In a way that's made things a little bit more difficult for me because, one of my responsibilities is sort of, it's minimalized a bit, Other items on the list, one of my friends suggested the car collection. My father and I have put together a car collection over the last, 40 years, and now that my father's out of the country and he's not driving, the collection has been turned over to me, Now, they're just cars. Another friend said, cars are not something to, an incentive, to stay clean. It's a passion. It's a hobby. It's anything, whatever your passion is, whatever you find, is something that you enjoy doing, So the cars are on the list now, and especially after all the trouble I had to go through to get them changed into my own name, I had to get them certified and all that. Now I'm like going, I don't want to have to lose them. Yeah, they're mine. If I get it. Now, as I said, the list is flexible. Number 3, and this is one of the big advantages the 12-step people have, is that 12 steps, you automatically get a support group. By definition, you go to the meetings, and the meetings consist of other addicts, other people who understand your cravings. Outside of that framework, I had to create my own support group, So my close friends, and I do include, to a certain degree, my therapist, my analyst, that's a professional support, but my close friends, the ones that I will talk to about this, a lot of them have kind of, I've got into fights with, and it's a lot to ask of people who are not addicts themselves to listen to you going on and on about your cravings every day. They tend to be sometimes judgmental, and I have a quick temper, and I tell them to F off, and then, and stuff like that. And some of them, there's one friend who is dealing with their own issues and addiction, but is more in the denial stage. So she's sort of at a different place than I am, and that just didn't work out as well, But I did for a while. I had my own support group, As I said, it's kind of faded. Now it's just me and it again, The fourth one is probably my favorite, I call personification of it. And the acronym for it is POIT, point, And this came about, a former friend of mine who has some addiction issues. He used to some marijuana and some drinking and stuff like that. But when I started binging again, he said to me, I have a system, and this is how I deal with addictions. And he said, I see my addiction as a dog that I keep chained up in my backyard. And I'll take it out for a walk, give it some exercise, bring it back, chain it up again. And I said, look, that may work for you. But my addictions, they're not little dogs that you keep chained up. My addictions are more like werewolves. I turn into it. It takes me over. And then I rampage. The whole neighborhood. And I'm like, until the werewolf is satisfied, satiated, and then then it switches back to me, And as I said, the binges are getting longer, The werewolves gets hungrier, Now, I came up with this, and I was discussing it with some people. I was told that the famous Jungian analyst, and she's written books about addiction. Her name is Marion Woodman, and she had eating disorders. So she had a personification of her cravings, but it was a muffin, because it was food, I mentioned in the last podcast Carrie Fisher, the actor, writer, and I came up with my own, system here, or whatever you want to call it, and I read her second book, The Best Awful, and she doesn't use a term for it, but she also had a personification for her cravings. And the personification of her cravings was a person, a historical figure, but a historical figure who has become mythologized. And the historical figure was Lucrezia Borgia, from the Borgia family, infamous Borgia family, late Italy, 1400s, early 1500s. So we're talking about 1490 to 1520, around there, And she's reputed to have had an affair with her own brother, Cesare Borgia, And Cesare Borgia is roughly the model for Machiavelli's The Prince this really manipulative guy. He said, you don't like somebody in the court, you have them killed, but you have somebody else blamed for it. That's the kind of thing he would do. And it's rumored that she may have poisoned her husband. Carrie Fisher, in her book, she talks about her inner Lucretia, and letting the inner Lucretia out. It was the inner Lucretia that wanted to binge on sex and drugs, and she would control. She tried to control, but it was just like my werewolf. Once she let the inner Lucretia out, there'd be havoc. This is optional, and I don't really use it much anymore. At one point I did talk about the werewolf and I even. I looked up online, and online people take this very seriously in terms of, as if werewolves are real things. So how to kill werewolves, and silver. So I had this chair that I call an ego chair, and I was sitting on it when I was battling my cravings, and I would have a silver coin, Didn't always help, but, it was a symbol, because silver is supposed to be bad for werewolves, My number 5 is called the intensity frequency scale, IF scale. This is just my own observations, I do talk about 1 day at a time. And remember at the beginning I said I'm 7 weeks clean. Remember we're talking about the number of weeks. I've got different levels of it, 1 second at a time when the cravings are really intense. And that's usually when you're on the thing, So there's 1 second at a time, OSAT, OSAAT, and then the next one is OMAT, 1 minute at a time, OHAT, 1 hour at a time, ODAT, which I mentioned, 1 day at a time, OWAT, 1 week at a time, OMNAT, 1 month at a time, and OYAT, 1 year at a time. So there are different levels of intensity for the cravings. And I've fine-tuned that a little bit, but we'll get back to that in the next session. My step 6, and we're going to come back to this in the next session because we're running out of time, and this was going to take a little time. Step 6 is specific methods of dealing with it. Acronym, SMODWI, SMODWI. Specific methods of dealing with it, and I've divided those into, for now, 5, So the first one is I call RCE, and I think this is one of the best ones. This is rechanneling energy, rechanneling addictive energy into something positive, productive, sort of similar to Freud's ego defense mechanism of sublimation, rechanneling energy into, so for me, it's my writing. Now it's the podcasts, it's there are things like going for walks, watching movies, reading, these are all positive channels for addictive energy, The second one, B, control burns. This is, the metaphor is forest fires where you set the fire, in order to control it, It's a control burn, but it's very dangerous. You're literally playing with fire. That is my subheading for that was PWF, playing with fire, So, and I used some of them, but I've abandoned them, because, they are too dangerous. They work up to a point, and we'll talk about that in the next session, Number C, totems, symbols, etc. And I've already mentioned the ego chair. I've mentioned the silver coin. I've got a Bast cat figurine, Bast, the cat goddess, Egyptian. I've got a Buddha, but sort of higher power, sort of not higher power. We'll talk about this more. It's whatever gives you, support. Symbols. Now D is I call it DAC, BTE, and these are psychological approaches, therapies, dream analysis, I'm in Jungian analysis, dream analysis, cognitive behavior therapy. I've adopted little bits of that, self-reinforcers, stuff like that, could be meditation in there. And then finally, PT, MOE, physical tests, medical opinions, etc. And I do visit my doctor every month, and she knows about my addictions, and she warns me, danger, high blood pressure, stuff like that. So we will come back to this. I will elaborate on the methods of dealing with this. So, civilians, junkies, bye from the Nutty Professor. Bye.